We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much. The Republicans, as is their tendency, are back at it, talking about wanting to cut Social Security. At least some of them are. Donald Trump is, as always, evading the issue. Well, and as we will hear in a moment, Kristen Welker of NBC News recently pressed Republicans in a debate as to whether or not they would cut Social Security by raising the retirement age. So far, the most adamant Republican, it seems, in terms of insisting on cuts to Social Security is Nikki Haley. And here to discuss that with us now and the broader forces at work, perhaps, is our good friend Lynn Parramore. Lynn is a writer and cultural critic, and we always look forward to her insights on these things. So, first of all, Lynn, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Always great to be with you, Richard.
So, what strikes you about hearing Nikki Haley, uh, the lone woman in the race on either side? Well, no, Marianne. To be fair, Marianne Williamson has been polling roughly at Nikki Haley's numbers on the Democratic side until recently. But uh, what does it tell you that Nikki Haley, the lone woman on the Republican side of the race, is the one also pushing the hardest now that Chris Christie's out for cuts to Social Security? Does that signify, as a cultural critic, anything broader at play for you?
Well, it's definitely political expediency. She's trying to pick up a segment of Trump's voters. And so she feels like she has to take a hard line on Social Security. She has taken a hard line on it in the past. Now she puts this in what seem to be gentle terms. I just want to save the program for my children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, by raising the age. But you and I both know that raising the age means that younger people are going to get fewer benefits over time, and they're probably the generation that's going to need the most. So it's a very cruel position to take, in my opinion. And it's also got a flavor of misogyny, as you've suggested to me in an exchange we had. And I think that might be hard for women to understand. It's similar to the feeling you get sometimes when women are really vociferous about denying abortion. And Nikki Haley stands up on that one too. Back when she was in South Carolina, really before she was governor, when she was a legislator, she called for not only a total ban on abortion, but she wanted to give um, fetuses or embryos the rights of full citizenship at the moment of conception. I mean, that is a really extreme view. And she was in favor of some failed bills that try to put that kind of thing across. Now she's softened up on abortion since then. And you hear her saying things recently like, oh, we should have compassion for the woman in Texas who couldn't get an abortion despite having a fetus with a fatal condition and the mother's having health problems. She had to go out of state. We should have compassion for that person. Great. But she doesn't talk about changing the law that I've heard. So that strikes me as a little bit of internalized misogyny. And there's probably some of that that goes along with her position on Social Security. I mean, look, I think it's impossible to be a woman raised in a patriarchal culture without some of that. You're raised in a culture that suggests that there's something about girls and women that's shameful, menstruation is shameful, that's, you're taught to be shameful about sex, that women are second class, and you absorb these messages as a female, especially in certain regions of the country, and you develop this kind of internal bigotry. And I think you can really see it coming out with girls as they get to sort of middle school years, and they start to sort of police each other. Girls get the idea and women get the idea that they're supposed to uphold social norms to a certain degree and
Hmm.
police each other. And girls will start doing that. They start slut shaming each other. They start doing a little more now of what I call crazy shaming. Oh, that one is borderline. That one's a mental case.
Huh.
Um, and they really they put each other down. There's even a musical version of Mean Girls coming out this year to kind of, represent that side of things. So when they grow up, these women project sexist ideas onto other women. And in the case of Social Security, there's always been a whiff of sexism around it. You wrote about Alan Simpson and his famous remark. He described Social Security as a milk cow with 310 million tits. And as you pointed out, he did that in an email to a woman, actually a woman associated with something called the National Older Women's League, no less.
Right.
And people were outraged at the time. People thought it was generally offensive, but of course, particularly offensive to women who rely on Social Security in their old age, even more so than men do. And they get lower benefits. I saw the recent tally from 2022 that said that men get an average of a little over 2,000 a month in benefits, and women, the average is about 1,600. So there's still a difference, and there's a gap. And women live longer. They have a longer period of time in which they need to sustain themselves, and they have actually statistically higher healthcare costs. So they need their Social Security. And Alan Simpson was sort of suggesting that, I don't know, that women collecting, or anybody collecting Social Security, but elderly women in particular, since it's so important to them, are somehow living the high life, and I don't know, taking cruises to the Bahamas with their Social Security check, all that,
Right.
60.
Alan Simpson's other famous, if you want to call it that, phrase of the time was referring to everybody on Social Security as greedy geezers, which is exactly what you're describing, that somehow the woman on getting Social Security benefits of $850 a month or so was somehow greedy, but Alan Simpson's wealthy Wyoming billionaire friends were not. And, it's interesting that you mentioned Alan Simpson, Senator Alan Simpson, and the other people in that, the male cadre of this anti-Social Security crowd, because Simpson's an interesting example of what might almost be the inverse of what you're describing with Nikki Haley, which is the old-fashioned, old school man who, on one hand, quote unquote, puts women on a pedestal. And of course, there's not much you can do as an autonomous human being if you're up on a pedestal, right? I mean, but supposedly put women up on a pedestal, open the doors for women and so on, and yet be abusive and nasty, even to someone you haven't even met. That feel that sense of privilege that you can just, be foul-mouthed and insulting, get a real job. I think he said to that woman, Ashley B. Carson,
Yes.
he
Talk to me
told,
when you get a real job.
call me when you get a real job. She was the head of the older women's league. So you have that, these two sides of patriarchy reflected. But I wonder if patriarchy isn't showing up in another way too. Donald Trump, I was struck by it at the time, and since when they had, it seemed like 300 candidates in 2016 for the Republican nomination. On the Republican side, he was the only one who said he would not cut Social Security.
Yep.
The only one. And I think that helped him break out of the pack. But my take on that was he could do that because he's a man's man, right? He doesn't have to. But it seems to me that Nikki Haley, like other women politicians in both parties before her, somehow I wondered if she doesn't also have to prove that she's, quote unquote, tough as any man, that there's that archaic sort of remnant of patriarchal thinking too. Not that it's gone, but I mean, you know what I mean. That
Yeah.
that residue of patriarchal thinking that says if I'm going to be a woman succeeding in a quote unquote man's world, I have to show that I can make the tough decisions. So whether it's celebrating the death of Muammar Gaddafi, if you're Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, or whether it's to be bipartisan about this, or whether it's Nikki Haley, being tough not only on Social Security, but extremely tough in those debates uh, on attacking Gaza, for example, then you're showing, in a way, isn't that just sort of the mirror image of being, I don't know the right term, but like a Southern belle or something?
Oh, interesting. You should use that term. Having grown up in North Carolina, I've had some personal experience about that. There's a memory from college. I went to the University of Georgia that stands out in my mind. There was a fraternity house, um, and a guy who was in that fraternity was going to give me a ride to North Carolina over the holidays or something. So I needed to speak to him. So I walked into the fraternity house to find him, and they were having dinner. They were all sitting down to dinner. And when I walked into the room, they all stood up in respect for me. There's that Southern belle on the pedestal idea.
Mhm.
So when my friend got up from the table to come and talk to me so we could sort out the trip, the moment I turned my back, half of the guys started doing catcalls
Right, right, right.
as they were standing. They were still standing up. And that very interesting dichotomy, you can see right in that moment the flip side of the virgin whore. You're up on a pedestal, but turn your back and we could, see your backside, and we have a completely different view. I mean, literally and figuratively. So that is something that was a real struggle to try to come to terms with as a young woman. And of course, Nikki Haley has been in South Carolina where things are even more intense. But, I think a lot of this goes back, on the subject of Social Security. If you go back to 1938, when there was an advisory council working out the details of Social Security, it's fascinating to look at the transcript. There was one man, I believe his name was Brown, on the advisory council who said, look, don't women need less money in retirement or when they're elderly than men? I mean, they know how to cook and clean, whereas a man has to hire somebody and go to a restaurant. I mean, that was the logic. And that kind of logic actually, there are still sexist rules baked into Social Security that we haven't dealt with. And older women still are not valued as much as they should be in our society. And for female politicians like Nikki Haley, I mean, most female politicians that we've been talking about, if not all in this conversation, are past the age of childbearing, right? They're menopausal, postmenopausal women. I mean, Nikki Haley is about my age. So you're in that very funky category in a patriarchal society. You are both threatening because you don't fit into this, structure of taking care of babies anymore, or, staying at home with your man. And you might be gaining some power. And if you're a female politician, you certainly are. You might be gaining some independence, and that's threatening. And so, as a woman politician, you've got to walk a very, very fine line. I don't envy being in that position. I think it must be very, very difficult. And Nikki Haley is trying to square the circle, to sound tough. One of the objections to having women run for president at one time was that they couldn't be the commander in chief. So she has to represent herself as the commander in chief and be tough. You saw Hillary Clinton doing that, and being tough means shooting people and being in favor of wars. So that's what we're going to hear her talk about. It's something that's been with us for a long time, and I've yet to see women really be able to work their way out of that bind completely. It's very difficult.
And I wonder, first of all, this may seem like a random thought and probably is, but I found myself wondering how many of those frat boys that you encountered in college are now alcoholic lawyers on their third marriages. Because, for one thing, they've never been taught how to relate to a woman like a human being. So they have no idea how to do it, or even that it's achievable. But in terms of Social Security, uh, again, this sort of double standard comes into play here because Nikki Haley and her party, they're supposed to be the party of the family, right? Protecting the family, and the woman as nurturer, the woman as bearer and rearer of children. And yet, it's precisely because so many women have taken time out of their careers to give birth and to raise their children, especially when they're young, that they're getting, screwed on their Social Security payments because the Social Security system, as yet, does not consider that compensable labor,
And
right?
that is one of those sexist ideas that's really baked into the cake. You can see in that particular rule, this old idea that women are really not supposed to work. They're supposed to stay home and take care of the kids, and that's their job. And a husband is supposed to support them, right? There's an actual discouragement in a sense for not working in the Social Security the way the rules are set up, because you could be married and not contributing, with a paycheck, but then end up getting spousal support. So that's one thing. But yes, women who are doing caregiving, particularly women, lower down on the economic ladder. I think the average woman loses 10 years from caregiving. And I'm saying caregiving, not just taking care of children, but taking care of elderly people, as we've
Right.
discussed. There's a lot of caregiving that women do. I mean, men do it too, obviously, but women do seem to do an inordinate amount. And that 10 years is not, doesn't get calculated into their benefits. And it's really, really shocking that we still don't value that work that women do. I mean, there absolutely should be a change where there's some kind of caregiving credit that is given to people, not just women, who are staying out of the workforce to care for others. I mean, people have to care for not only children, but people with disabilities. I mean, the list goes on and on. And why should they be penalized in their old age for that? That's a really unhealthy idea in our society.
And it becomes even worse when you consider that, Lynn Parramore, that first of all, a 50% divorce rate in this country, where women, are much more imperiled financially when that happens. I mean, I think it's tough on both parties for sure, but women are struggle as a result of that. And the fact that, I mean, the first book to open my eyes to this, I think, was Elizabeth Warren's book, The Two-Parent Trap. That, I grew up in an era where that traditional nuclear family, whether you think it's a healthy idea for its members or not, it was economically feasible. Even a working class level income like my father's was enough. He got promoted into management later, but his working class income was enough that my mother could stay at home. She didn't want to, but that's another discussion. But she could stay at home and quote unquote raise the kids. And one
As,
car
as
was,
long as she didn't get a divorce.
as long as she didn't get a divorce. And believe me, she thought about it and couldn't do it, and couldn't do it for many years.
Right.
Uh, and we had one car, a used car, but only one person was going to work, right? And on and on. So the fact that people, mostly women, are bearing the brunt of archaic representations of a household that aren't even financially possible anymore for people who want it. I don't know how many people want it. Also, you throw in the fact that, and I don't know where this fits in the whole matrix of things, but it's interesting. I just read a Pew study that said that the rate of never been married 40-year-olds is higher than it's ever been.
Yeah,
It's way above, it's a multiples of what it was in 1980, for example.
absolutely.
So you have this disillusion of the nuclear family, but you have like someone like Nikki Haley coming along, uh, sort of strong arming those dead values
Yeah.
onto our political system, even though she, like so many right-wing women before her, she doesn't live those. She's a career person. She's a success. She's, clearly extremely hard worker, workaholic, whatever you want to call it. So It's not
Yeah,
like
it's interesting, isn't it? And that's where the squaring of the circle comes in. You know, you've had this movement in recent years of what are called trad wives, traditional wives, really promoting this whole lifestyle that looks like something out of the 1950s. It's like a nostalgia for women staying at home and taking care of the children. And, you know, as we've discussed, that's still baked into the way we deal with women and men in their old age. You know, a woman who is married to a man for 8 years and is taking care of the children, maybe even, you know, cooking the man's meals as he goes to law school so that he can get a job and taking care of his house.
right.
If she gets divorced from him before the 10-year mark, she's not going to get spousal benefits. So there is a sexism baked into that idea, and women are sort of encouraged to stay in marriages even when, you know, they might not anything from unfulfilling to downright abusive because they have to wait 10 years to collect the spousal benefits. So we should not be engineering marriages in that way. I mean, there should be a split down the middle in terms of benefits. There should be this child caregiving credit, and you just divvy everything up 50-50. And you know, you would get rid of some of this nonsense that doesn't reflect the way we live. And, you know, you were talking about never married women over 40. I happen to be one of those women, and I get penalized in the way we do things because, you know, when people collect spousal support, where does that money come from? Well, it's subsidized by single working people. So I'm one of those single working people, and I'm not going to get spousal benefits. I'm not going to get divorcee benefits. I'm not going to get widow benefits. And that is not totally fair.
And it extends into, for example, our health insurance system, employer health care, where rates are set on the assumption that, you know, there's a single contract rate and then there's the family rate, which is 2.5, but the aggregates, you know, I used to work in the nerdier aspects of that world. In the aggregate, you know, the single people to a certain extent are in employer plans are subsidizing the married people and the people with kids. I love kids as kids. I mean, I think kids are great, but people who have never had kids, who don't plan to have kids, are, if they own their home, they're subsidizing the education system. That's probably a good thing, right? But because education benefits the entirety of society, but it's something at least that should be factored into the way we treat single people, especially
Yes.
women, especially divorced women, especially widowed women who
Single
are
mothers.
single mothers. Single mothers have it worst of all, I think, you know. And the fact that we don't offer childcare in this country, the fact that we don't have certain worker protections. If you're a single mom, let's face it, most working parents are single mothers, not all, but most. If you're a single mom working in a fast food restaurant and they won't tell you what shift you're working day after tomorrow, you can't get childcare. It's
Yeah.
simple things like that. So the fact that we don't have protections for these things, much less a living wage, is incredible. And yet, what I struggle with, Lynn, is how to communicate these issues to the public. I mean, in a sense, somebody like Nikki Haley is a good uh, fulcrum or whatever to start talking about these things. But I struggle with how to communicate these things because you get a variety of responses, uh, including,
Social Security is a complicated system. It's
right,
more complicated than it should be. And so it's hard for people to understand these details of what we're talking about and who gets spousal benefits and how long they have to wait and who gets disability benefits. Even, you know, people trying to apply for Social Security are very confused by it. So that's part of it. And then, you know, you have this misinformation that is just churned out year after year after year. I mean, you go back to Obama's deficit commission, There's a Democrat, and the co-chairs of that commission are Alan Simpson, the Republican, as we've noted, and also Erskine Bowles, the former White House chief of staff, who is a Democrat, and both of them were calling for cuts to Social Security. So we've had this problem, across the political aisle. And the idea that Social Security contributes to the deficit, as both of them were saying, is false. It's just false. If there's one thing, well, there's probably a few things, but that's one thing I'd really like to communicate to the public, because the deficit hawks are circling again now.
They
Social
sure are.
Security does not contribute to the deficit. It's independent from the federal, everything else in the federal system, and it only can spend the revenues it gets through taxes or that which accumulates in the trust fund. And even if the trust fund dried up, it is forbidden by law to borrow. So legally, it cannot contribute to the deficit. And yet Republicans certainly, and even some Democrats, even Joe Biden at one
Oh,
time,
yes. Oh, Joe Biden has a
very
long,
vociferous.
Joe Biden, as you know, broke with a very long political history dating back to the Chester Alan Arthur administration of, no, okay, not that far, but calling for cuts to Social Security. He did change his campaign tune, called for expansion. He hasn't done anything about it since, but he has held the line on not cutting it. Um, but thinking of these deficit commissions, and now the Republicans are about to are working their tails off to commission start another one, and some Democrats are collaborating with them on that. Reminds me of another phrase that the deficit hawks, and you're absolutely right, they misrepresent the finances of the situation, but another phrase that the deficit hawks love to do, which is not irrelevant to the conversation, and which is they love to talk about being, quote unquote, the adults in the room. In other words, and you'll hear that all the time, right? Let's have an adult conversation. Let's not let our emotions take hold of us. Let's look at the facts, which is exactly the way the husband talks to the little woman in Leave It to Beaver, right? And or Make Room for Daddy, or whatever those shows were. And there's another one. What was it?
Bleeding Heart Liberal is one I
Bleeding
remember
Heart Liberal.
as a
But
kid. And I used to remember thinking, what's wrong with having a bleeding heart?
right, but the idea of the adult in the room,
Yeah.
first of all, based on totally false premises, but it also infantilizes everyone who doesn't agree with you.
Yes.
And especially, it says that it's infantile to care about the well-being of the helpless, of the sick, of the poor, of the people in need, of the elderly. In other words, the manly thing to do, to bring it back to where we came in a sense, the manly, quote unquote, thing to do, whether you're a man or not, is to make the tough decisions. But the tough decisions are never, we can't afford that new F-35 fighter jet, right? The tough
Somehow we
decisions,
always find the money for that.
right? The tough decisions are never, let's not boost the $800 billion military budget by 15%. It's always, grandma can't eat today. That's the tough decision. And it seems to me that the Nikki Haleys of this world, as well as some of the, of course, male Republicans as well, are are playing into that as well. I'm going to be adult about this.
Oh
And
yeah. And okay, I'm an adult and I really don't want to see elderly people homeless on the street, which is exactly what is happening. I was just looking at an article. Was it in Bloomberg? I can't recall. But anyway, it was revealing that younger baby boomers have a rate of homelessness that is alarmingly high right now. And it's because they cannot keep up with the expenses of growing old in this country. Now, if it's bad for younger baby boomers, imagine what it's going to be like for Gen X, Gen Z, on down the line. They have fewer and fewer decent pension plans. They're in the gig economy. That contributes negatively to your
right.
security income. all of it, and maybe they have a 401k if they're not rating it to pay off their student debt. So it's
Right.
passing the problem down. So penalizing people uh, in that way, to me, that's the childish thing to do, not to recognize that the well-being of other people, that we're all connected, and the well-being of the country depends on having people have secure jobs and decently paying jobs and a dignified retirement. If Nikki Haley and the rest of them really wanted to update Social Security and make sure that that trust fund is robust for decades to come, they would be thinking about raising wages and paying people more, because that's one of the main reasons that the trust fund is even having any issue to begin with, is that when the program was structured, there was an assumption that wages were going to gradually go up. Well, they haven't. And we haven't accounted for that yet. So one of the ideas that many have suggested, and then Biden has suggested his openness to that, to this idea, is raising that cap on earnings that are taxed on Social Security, which I think is 168,000 right now. I think Elon Musk, in like he spent that in, I mean, he earned that in like 4 seconds in
I did the
2024.
math. I did the math about 3 years ago and saw that Jeff Bezos reached the cap in 28 seconds after the big ball fell on New Year's Eve. But then somebody writing for Bloomberg calculated 10 seconds. I was more conservative in my estimate, but and that one went viral because 10 seconds is catchy, but I should have just fudged it. But in any event, the point well taken. And another way to address this and be the real adult in the room without uh, drawing on general revenues, but keeping the program self-supporting as it is, would be to raise the minimum wage along with and average wages along with productivity growth in this country, because that comes out of the private sector. It doesn't come out of the public sector. So the more people earn in their working years, the more is set aside for their Social Security and Medicare, by the way, and the more viable both of these programs become. But of course, the adults in the room don't do the adult things and discuss all the options that are available, because it's a big scam, isn't it?
Yes, it's a Ponzi scheme. And going back to this idea we started with in terms of hostility to Social Security and its connection to misogyny, I think it's worth remembering. You and I have talked about this before, but the way older women have been treated throughout history is appalling when you look back. I mean, in this country, for example, if you look at, I think there were 16 women who were falsely accused of witchcraft in Salem who either were murdered or died. 13 of them were past childbearing years. And that was true of the majority of people who were murdered between the 15th and the 18th century in Europe. So older women have always been looked upon with suspicion. They don't really belong. They're superfluous. They're untrustworthy. Maybe they have powers and skills that we're afraid of, when in fact, there are a lot of evolutionary scholars now and biologists and anthropologists who believe that they've been vital to our survival as a human species. Rather than being redundant, they have helped the human species survive by passing down technical knowledge, cooking, domesticating plants, and so on. And that's why it's encouraging on the one hand, to have more female politicians in the arena, but the idea that they have to act like some stereotypical toxic man in order to get votes is very it's very disconcerting. It would be nice for a woman to be able to claim those values of nurturing and empathy that have always been associated with women. I mean, I don't essentialize. Men have those qualities too,
Sure.
but and be taken seriously.
And I was just going to say it would be nice for men to be able to claim those
Absolutely.
values too, since they're so invaluable to the survival of our species. We're a mirror neuron driven community. Community and touch and companionship are as essentially human survival. We're not the competitive red and in tooth and claw creatures we've been.
No, we would never have made it if that were the case. And, I love to draw insight from the feminist Dorothy Dinnerstein, who wrote this wonderful book in the 70s, in which she talked about how if we really, wanted to make one change in our society that would benefit us in so many ways, our attitude towards the environment, war, just the way we treat each other, have men involved much more directly in the early child care, the early child caring years, so that they would be able to express that nurturing and caregiving that is innate within all of us and not be penalized for it, not be looked upon like some kind of mutant if they want to take paternity leave. It's a shift that there have been some gradual incremental steps towards it, but men are still penalized by the way we go, by the way we go about administering parental leave. It's often still biased against men who want to stay home with their children. And again, built on the assumption that it's women who are supposed to be the quote unquote primary caregivers. I mean, primary caregiver, that role was in the sort of policy descriptions of left-leaning foundations until very recently. A female is the primary caregiver and is going to be given an amount of time off, whereas the male is some kind of like extraneous being. And that's a very dangerous idea, I think, and halts our ability to make the most of those empathetic, nurturing, compassionate, innate traits that have helped us survive as a species.
Absolutely. And in conclusion, Lynn Parramore, as always, I've really enjoyed our discussion, but I won't let us leave the topic of Social Security without mentioning the name of Frances Perkins, who was instrumental in the creation of Social Security and was also the first woman ever to serve as a cabinet level secretary in a presidential administration, that being the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So we need.
She's really a hero of mine. I was in Daramuscata, Maine last summer, and I don't think she was born there, but she spent a lot of time there. But there's a little museum, and you just think, how in the world did this woman, was she accepted with the ideas that she had at that time? Because I wonder how a woman would do on the national stage now, promoting the values that she promoted. But yeah, she is really an icon and somebody who I think should be better known and appreciated for what she brought to this country.
Well, there was a country song when I was a kid called "We Need a Whole Lot More of Jesus and a Lot Less Rock and Roll." I'm going to say we need a whole lot more Frances Perkins and a lot less Nikki Haley. That's my conclusion.
I love it.
Hi, this is Richard RJ Eskow for the Zero Hour. We urgently need your help here at the Zero Hour to keep the program going, so we would appreciate anything you could do. If you're able to contribute, please go to patreon.com/the Zero Hour or become a paid subscriber of our newsletter at eskow.substack.com. If you can help, we would very much appreciate it.